so that we don't have a sexist situation here. So we have to have a Sir in order to balance the Baroness. And we have Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman with us. And he is a Professor of War Studies and Vice Principal of Research, King's College, London. And Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman has been a Professor of War Studies at King's College, London since 1982. He became Vice Principal of Research at King's in 2003. He was educated at Whitley Bay Grammar School and universities of Manchester, York, and Oxford. Before joining King's, he held research appointments at Nuffield College, Oxford, IISS, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. Elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995 and awarded the CBE Commander of the British Empire. In 1996, he was appointed Official Historian of the Falklands Campaign. In 1997, Professor Freedman has written extensively on nuclear strategy and the Cold War, as well as commentating regularly on contemporary security issues. His most recent books include an Adelphi paper on the Revolution in Strategic Affairs, an edited book on strategic coercion, an illustrated book on the Cold War, a collection of essays on British defense policy and Kennedy's wars that covers the major crisis of the early 1960s over Berlin, Cuba, and Vietnam. In addition, a book on deterrence was published in 2004 at the official history, and the official history of the Falklands Campaign was published in the summer of 2005. He has also written widely on military intervention and is editor of the book Military Intervention in Europe. His most recent book, A Choice of Enemies, America Confronts the Middle East, came out in May 2008 in the United States and was published in the UK in July. Sir Freedman.
Thank you very much. I think it is always helpful to be precisely identified. I was once merely introduced as Professor Freedman, and a Conservative MP, sorry Pauline, came up staggering to me afterwards and said, I presume it is to you to whom I owe my economic philosophy. And I realized he thought I was Milton. So you can see what a thrill it was for me to listen to Adam Smith just before. I just wanted to say first just how delighted I am to be here at ICT. King's has got a new partnership with the Interdisciplinary Centre and the University of Pennsylvania and Institute of Diplomacy in Amman, the Institute for the Centre for the Study of Radicalism and Political Violence. And we're finding this cooperation already producing very great dividends. It's very good to have a cooperative working on these important issues. And we called it radicalism and political violence because it isn't just about terrorism. Indeed, terrorism has to be put in this wider context. And what I want to do this afternoon is to talk a little bit about, and instead of following up from what has just been said, and what actually Adam Smith did say beforehand, about the strategies that we may need to adopt in order to deal with the challenges that we face. My sort of text is one of my favorite quotes from Mao, which was that one should despise the enemy strategically but respect him tactically. And I think that seems to me the way that we should approach this. It is foolish not to respect what can be done and not to find every way possible of preventing and countering and mitigating. But one should not fall into the trap of believing that we're dealing with a collection of strategic geniuses who always get it right, always outsmart us, and are on the right side of history. Because they make the errors too. And we see these groups come and we see these groups go. And just because they may talk in the language of millennia doesn't mean to say that they really do have infinite patience or can't be discouraged by evidence of their futility. My argument basically is that Al-Qaeda and such groups pose a security threat, but they don't pose a strategic threat. A strategic threat means that they can genuinely challenge the state, states, their composition, indeed the international system of states, which is their ambition. They're a security threat because they can cause enormous hurt and pain And they can threaten states in different ways, by making them very difficult to govern, by challenging their ability to provide safety for their people and deliver basic services. But that's not the same as being able to take over the states themselves and run them. The one example, the examples we have of Islamists in power, and there are some examples, demonstrate that they're not necessarily any better at working out how to govern states as anybody else. But we have to keep in mind all of this, because Al-Qaeda presents itself as a strategic project. And those of you, I'm sure, here, many people are aware of the literature on the move from the near enemy to the far enemy, the advantage of globalism for this, for what they were trying to do, financing, recruitment, the swapping of techniques and tactics, a brand that is instantly recognizable, which any multinational would be rather proud of if it wasn't actually for such a distasteful enterprise. But so far it has been a strategic failure. Since 9/11, they have managed occasional and disparate attacks, but have not yet been able, in the Western world, to turn these into campaigns. And without a campaign, they remain no more than disparate and appalling but disparate attacks. Only with a campaign of regularity do you create that sense of irresistibility that challenges the state and its ability to maintain order. We're not closer to a caliphate. The main state that they thought was going in there was appropriate, which was following Islamic precepts as they would understand. Afghanistan under the Taliban, it's not quite as we would want it, but it's certainly not as they would want it either. Osama bin Laden has become, if anything, more of a political, more Clausewitzian as time has gone on. After the Madrid bombings, there was talk of offers to the West to get out of Iraq, and otherwise we'll start again in 6 months and so on, as if he had ability to turn these campaigns on and off. And this had very little impact on Western policies. Britain was hit in July 2005. Again, it didn't make any difference to what the British did. If there were problems with our commitment to Iraq, they were evident beforehand, and it was a problem with the policy, not because Al-Qaeda was trying to push us out of it. Now, there's obviously exceptions to this, but the exceptions are not where the terrorist campaigns as such are doing well, but they have at least the indicators of an insurgency. If you look, where are they strong? And we heard about this morning. Afghanistan, Pakistan. Where they have roots, where they have bases, where they are part of the political system in some way and form. And even, again, as we heard, the Al-Qaeda part of that is actually diminishing, but the Islamist part of it is still obviously extremely strong. Look elsewhere where there's a serious problem, with Hamas, with Hezbollah. It used to be the case, one might say, with the IRA, with the Tamils. These are all places where there are real political roots, where they can work with the local political grain, and where they have been able to establish some representative role, however distasteful this may be found. Where they have been unable to do that, then by and large their campaigns have not taken root, and they have got themselves, they've made themselves weak. I'll come back to some reasons why that may be so. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the fact that they can cause security problems is a trivial issue. Of course, it's not. And it can threaten states, as we heard this morning about Afghanistan, and we've seen it, though hopefully it's being got over in Iraq. If there is a constant undermining of the ability of the state to do what it should be doing with its economy, with the delivery of services and so on, then that causes real problem. But that is not the same as being able to take over the state for your own ends and to create the opportunities to implement Sharia law, let alone move towards a new caliphate. Where they are able to develop a political presence, take root, then this creates problems of its own and strategic decisions that they must face. For example, to what extent do you engage and negotiate with the status quo? To what extent do you take part in elections? Now, anybody who's looked at the history of radical political movements will recognize these strategic debates as being common to all radical movements. Do you take on the appearance of a constitutional party, or do you set yourself apart from it for the sake of ideological purity? If you go for ideological purity, do you render yourself irrelevant and fail to make any contact with attempts to deal with the real grievances of the people you claim to be speaking for? But as soon as you acknowledge the legitimacy of the system by standing for election, taking your place in Parliament, have you become co-opted? Are you on the route, say, that the IRA took? Where people often say to me, well, look, the IRA have been successful. Well, the IRA is successful in the sense that Sinn Féin is now part of the political structure of Northern Ireland. But of course, the IRA's campaign was to deny the legitimacy of a Northern Ireland state. They've become something very different. This, to me, is fine. It's not a bad outcome at all. It's not what they were trying to do. Secondly, violence becomes a liability. Again, something the IRA wanted. We remember the pictures of Jerry Adams with the arguing for the ballot and the bullet, Yasser Arafat in his time arguing for the same thing. But it's actually a very difficult balance to manage, because at some point people say, if you've got the ballot, why do you need the bullet? So again, there are problems that they have to address in terms of making the strategic case for continuing with violence. And we've seen that even when they're not engaging in elections, just how much the violence can be an embarrassment. And reference again was made to that from the famous Zawahiri letter to Zarqawi about hearts and minds, and is it really wise to attack mosques even if they're of the Shia? The Jordanian wedding party that was attacked. These were big public relations blows to their cause. And third, of course, violence becomes a means of solving all disputes. I often think that counter-terrorist operatives could spend some useful hours watching The Sopranos, because you get a sense there of the consequences of a culture of violence when the disloyalty and moving away from the true faith, any suggestion that you're double-dealing produces instant retribution and elimination. And of course, successful counter-terrorism strategies have played on exactly that sort of concern, creating the sense that there are collaborators in their midst, that somebody is working with the authorities, that nobody can be trusted. And that's, again, a vulnerability. And if you look at failed campaigns, such as the one in Algeria in the 1990s, eventually they consumed their own because of this sense that the thing to do with somebody who opposed you was to kill them. That there was no way of negotiating because you're dealing all the time with absolute ends. There's no room for compromise or bargaining. Now, what does that mean in terms of how we operate? So I think the basic challenge in we're dealing not with terrorists, we're dealing with political movements that use terrorism. They don't necessarily use it all the time. Sometimes they go off on it, sometimes they go off it. And we've got ourselves entangled by worrying about who is a terrorist. A terrorist is somebody who uses terrorism. But groups, to take an example which nobody thinks about in these terms, but was once so described, the African National Congress, its moment of terrorism was a particular time in its history. It was useful to describe it as a terrorist group for certain people at certain times. In 1998, the Kosovo Liberation Army, at the start of 1998, was being described as a terrorist organization by Western countries. Later we decided that wasn't a particularly useful definition because the politics has changed. So our problem is with radical political movements which may use violence. We want to get them off the violence because that affects our security and our safety. But sometimes if we do that, we have an even bigger problem because then they become legitimate, they can acquire legitimacy, and we have to deal with it in different ways. We have to accept the logic of political debate and discourse. The next point that follows from that, which again was a point that was being made in the last session, is we really then have to think through about the narratives, about the messages. What is it that we're trying to say? And I think this goes a lot deeper than just questions of hearts and minds, which again is a phrase I have some problems with. In most areas, in many discussions, we'll put hearts and minds against each other, the emotional heart and the cool mind, and so on. The hearts and mind is much more than water, providing water or energy or building schools and so on, good though these may be. Often it requires addressing real grievances, looking at local power structures, recognizing that there are problems with abuses of power, with corruption, with the difficult regimes that we sometimes find ourselves supporting in the name of counter-terrorism. Unless you start to recognize those sort of things, then you're not going to develop an effective counter-terrorist and counter-insurgency approach. So the basic argument that I'm suggesting is that we are engaged in a series of debates, arguments, sometimes full confrontations with radical groups. Actually, in many ways, this is much easier than some of the confrontations we've had in the past. By and large, we're not, as we were with liberalism's good, with Nazism and fascism and with communism, dealing with ideologies that potentially appeal directly to Western populations. The Islamism may appeal to one segment, hopefully a small segment, of our own populations. It's addressed to that. But basically, we're not facing the same sorts of threats. And I think that's one reason why we often find it very difficult, for the reasons that we've just heard, to find the language to deal with this. In some ways, it doesn't seem to be our problem. What is true Islam? What is the proper way to be a Muslim? I would find myself uncomfortable when I hear our politicians lecturing people on what Islam is really about. We have to be careful about that. If I hear somebody else telling me what Judaism is about or Christianity is about, I say, well, what right have you got to tell us these things? So we have to be very careful. It's not, in some ways, our debate. It makes it easier, but it's one reason why I think we find it quite hard to develop the appropriate narratives to address it. What we're really seeing is a problem of globalization. In this sense, it is a global issue, of a series of conflicts around the world in which we have a stake, sometimes a very big stake, and an argument going on that for many of us it's not our argument, but we are affected by the way it's conducted and how it plays out. To return to where I started, the Al-Qaeda strategy of the far enemy assumed that their local enemies were there only because the West propped them up, because they were puppets and tools of the West. Now, I think that, as with all these things, there's elements within that we can recognize, but equally obviously it's only part of the story. But I think that's one reason why we find this so difficult to deal with, to work out what exactly is the political narrative we're trying to develop of our own role in these conflicts and how it should be addressed, and whether it is up to us to be the ones to push for democratization and reform in Muslim countries. These seem to me to be the issues that are going to be addressing us over the next few years. I hope that we've seen the worst of Al-Qaeda. That's probably a foolish thing to say. It invites an event the next day. But we know there will be further terrorism. We know there will be further outrages. But I think we have to have confidence enough that this particular mode of operation will not succeed, that in the end it is doomed to a sort of futility, however painful it may be to go through all of that. But it still leaves open very big and basic questions about how a large part of our planet governs itself and the extent to which we can separate ourselves from the various issues that that creates and live in our own world, as if somehow it doesn't have anything to do with us. There's a great temptation at the moment, and you can see this not only with these particular issues, but old issues of humanitarian intervention, ethnic cleansing, and all those sort of collection of issues which preoccupied us during the 1990s, to assume that somehow we've got ourselves too involved, too engaged, that prudence requires that we step back a bit and don't get so involved in the future. And given the experience of this decade, you can understand that. But I don't think we can, and I suspect we're still going to get drawn in to a lot of these conflicts. That seems to me to be the issue that we now have to address. Despise the enemy strategically, but still respect him tactically. Thank you.